Warlocks, it's your turn. Exotic Armor Tier List Update 2021. We got some new exotics to talk about, and by new, I mean exotics that I haven't reviewed since the previous list. So let's talk about all 4 of them. Fellwinter's Helm. Yeah. Back in Season of the Worthy. Arc, Solar, and Void melee kills create a burst of energy. You don't know the cadence.
I know. I thought I did. I got the first one.
Yeah.
Pretty good. Fellwinter's Helm.
Fellwinter's Helm. Arc, Solar, and Void melee kills create a burst of energy, weakening nearby enemies with finishers and kills against tougher enemies, increasing the radius of the burst and the duration of the effect. While this is a really interesting helm in terms of its exotic perk, I have seen it almost nowhere. That being said, I think this is underrated. Being able to use a finisher to proc the effect really helps this, since if it was just limited to charged melees only, I think it'd be pretty weak. The debuff is potent on top of the fact that it actually disorients targets, with the radius of the effect being larger than you'd think even on the weakest of enemies. I don't think this is really needed in lower end PvE, but it definitely has some utility towards the higher end. You just have to ensure that you're hitting a big group of enemies and that you have an escape plan. Trying to spawn trap enemies is probably going to be your best bet with this thing. I would say this is potentially worth it if you and your team can really work together to make it work, but I don't think it revolutionizes the master or GM experience. The problem is that it just relies on big clumps of enemies to make it really powerful. Tagging 1 or 2 dregs with this thing isn't really going to be a difference maker over the course of an entire nightfall. Dawn Chorus, one of the more interesting looking exotics in the game, enhances your burn and daybreak damage. Daybreak projectiles cause targets to burn on contact, increasing your daybreak blade damage on those targets, and all of your burn effects last longer, gaining you a small amount of melee energy for each tick of burn damage. So, how much energy we talking here? Well, actually a pretty decent amount. Using your bottom tree melee, if the burn lasts the full duration, you get your melee charge back. The only problem is that, for the most part, the only time stuff is surviving that long is in Legend or Master Law sectors if you're by yourself, if you hit Majors or Ultras, or if you get the explosion effect to hit other weaker targets. Otherwise, maybe a boss is going to live long enough in the Strike playlist or something like that. So my thing is, what kind of benefit are you really getting from this effect? You get your melee back so that you can melee another target so it takes a bunch of burn damage where you don't kill the target so that you can get your melee back. Burn damage isn't really that significant, and as we'll cover, Necrotic Grip does the whole melee AoE burn damage thing quite well. You can use a solar grenade too to tag targets for some burn to get that melee charge back if you want. The other side of this is the Dawnblade portion, which is considerably more impressive, having the damage of each swing ramp up considerably on a burning target. But it does take a few hits for it to actually start ramping up that damage, meaning you'll be about halfway through your super by the time you start to see that bonus damage. Essentially, this turns your Dawnblade into a super that's not actually bad for fighting bosses, which would bolster Top Tree's super considering how tame it is compared to the rest of the subclass. Overall, I think I would give Dawn Chorus an it's okay out of 5. Nothing super remarkable, mainly because Sunbracers are a thing, and I think Dawn Chorus takes a back seat to Sunbracers, unless maybe you're using bottom tree. Necrotic Grips are pretty good. Damaging enemies with melee poisons them with increasing damage over time, and if they die, they spread the poison. This poison can continue to chain off of anything killed until there are no targets left to be affected. The best part of Necrotic Grip is that you don't need to kill anything. It is simply damage only, meaning you could hypothetically just run into a giant mob of enemies, smack one of them, kill that enemy, and then watch the rest of them burn away. Not to mention that this damage over time effect lasts for quite a long time. Now, in terms of practical application in higher end content, you're still putting yourself at risk for what can boil down to killing a few enemies a little bit faster. But in most other content in the game, especially if you're solo, there is not a lot to hate about these gloves. Finally, Mantle of Battle Harmony is sort of like the mods from Season of the Chosen, demanding that you match your subclass element with your weapon element for a bonus. In this case, it's bonus super energy whenever you get a kill with a weapon matching the element of your subclass. If you have full super, you get about a 20% weapon damage buff instead. Here's the thing. Warlocks already have very good elemental subclass exotics. Crown of Tempest and Geomags for Arc, Phoenix Protocol for Well, Sun Braces for Solar, Void is maybe a little bit weaker, you got Skull of Dire, Hamkara, and Nezarec Sin. But if you're in an activity that doesn't lock your loadout, and you can meet the requirements of this exotic, you can use this to get to your super and then swap to Skull or Phoenix or Geomag, whatever. There are plenty of good elemental weapons to use as of this video as well. Palindrome, Igneous Hammer, and Waking Vigil hand cannons for starters. The super energy gains are pretty noticeable. I was able to get double the amount of super energy in this Lost Sector example on screen when using Mantle compared to not using it. My main gripe is that the timer does not refresh on kill, so to get the most out of it, you need to pace your kills, which isn't something a lot of people are going to do. You will naturally pace yourself in higher difficulty content though, since things just take longer to kill. I would say this is more suited towards solo play than it is group play, but if you're willing to meet the requirements, it's not too shabby either way. The damage buff is pretty nice too. But I'm not sure if I'm using it in content that locks my loadout over the top subclass exotics though. Phoenix Protocol is simply too good, Geomag gives you basically 20% of your super for free, and Skull sees good returns too when thrown well. However, I would still say that it's up there for most other activities, especially when you can swap your armor. As far as PvP goes, the energy gains aren't very remarkable. You'll get a couple of seconds off your super compared to not using it, scaling better at lower intellect levels, but unless you're doing a lot of swapping to Geomags, the main benefit of Mantle is going to be that damage boost after a kill when you have your super. But that requires you to hold your super in order to gain the benefit. Plus, if you're using a 120 RPM hand cannon, for example, I'm guessing you likely have a damage perk on that hand cannon already, enabling those 2-taps. For some people, that's going to be very, very viable. For others, well, I imagine you're going to want to use your super in PvP because using your super in PvP is fun. Those are your newer exotics. Next, we're going to re-review the older exotics to see if anything got shuffled around. And as I said in the Titan video, not much is really getting shuffled around. PvE Voidwalkers. I think it's actually pretty close between all three of your exotics, Skull, Nezarec, and Controverse, and I think it really depends on the playstyle when it comes down to which one you pick. Skull is going to be a set and forget kind of pick. You fling your Nova, you get energy back, and you continue with your day. Nezarec is going to be for the Slayers out there who are capable of keeping that buff rolling, which I do think is a bit tougher to pull off in higher end content compared to Controverse or Skull. Nezarec isn't technically a Void exotic, but it works much better with Void. And Controverse is solid in GM Nightfalls, boosting your damage against champions thanks to the ability to have it proc twice on the same target if you're using Vortex Grenade, and if the target stays within range of the grenade for long enough. That makes stunned champions the perfect target for this. And if Oppressive Darkness is a seasonal mod, well, you can't really make champion killing any easier than that. My only gripe is just the intentionally inconsistent energy returns. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. For PvE Dawnblades, Phoenix Protocol reigns supreme in GM content, and will continue to until something is done about it, period. Nothing beats the amount of wells you're able to get as a result. Besides Phoenix Protocol, it's Sunbracers. The synergy they have with Top Tree makes you a non-stop grenade and melee spamming murder machine. Towards the higher end of play, this is going to be less and less effective without some initial damage on certain targets, but even then, getting back ability energy is a staple of the subclass branch, and you will be able to get energy back almost regardless of what you're doing. Wings of Sacred Dawn were placed here last year, but I'm removing them this year. For Stormcaller, as much as I would like to give it to Crown of Tempest again, I think with Chaos Reach's recent surge of popularity and my ratings being more weighted towards Legend, Master, and GM content, it has to go to Geomags. Crown of Tempest is great in most other content in the game, even a good amount of Legend content, but as you push into Master and GM, it gets a bit harder to keep that buff rolling, especially considering you need to get your melee in that rotation as well. Chaos Reach is fine, I don't think it's anything too crazy, but it does more or less get you a champion kill whenever you use it. Outside of GM and Master Nightfalls, I'm probably taking Crown of Tempest, provided I can put myself in a position to chain my abilities a lot. Getaway Artist is an exotic with a lot of fun build potential, but it's not something I really take seriously when I gotta buckle down. And Storm Dancer's Brace is a nice alternative to Crown of Tempest, boosting your Storm Trance damage. But if we're in a GM, I'm probably going Chaos Reach for the faster damage output, and if I'm in a place where I can use Crown, I'm using Crown instead, in order to get supers considerably more often. The neutral exotic tier list also remains the same, simply adding Necrotic Grip to the list. Lunafaction is a staple for Deepstone Crypt's final boss and will always mesh well where Phoenix Protocol is not needed, or maybe on top of Phoenix Protocol, although I value Phoenix Protocol much more than Lunafaction in most other activities. Otherwise, the other exotics on this list are Ophidian Aspect, Claws of Ahamkara, Nezarec Sin, Winter's Guile, Verity's Brow, and Chromatic Fire. None of these exotics changed in any way since last year, and therefore remain as powerful as they did last year. Ophidian's global weapon buffs are outstanding, Claws can allow for greater build potential to a slight degree, Winter's Guile allows for insane melee synergy with a 1-2 punch shotgun, which might be a bit overkill and tougher to pull off in higher end content. Verity's Brow is still a little bit under the radar, but I think that's for a good reason. It's fine, but I think if you're going for a team-wide support kind of build, it's really tough to fight against Phoenix Protocol, or even just going full Aeon with your fire team instead. We're going to throw Chromatic Fire in there as well, but definitely more towards the middle. Explosions, yeah, they're fun, but they're definitely more oriented for non-master and GM content. As for subclass-specific PvP exotics, last year, Controverse Hold was demolishing everything in its path. That reign of terror has ended, but there hasn't really been much competition in the slot, mainly because there haven't been any new exotics to compete in that slot. In fact, most Warlock subclass-specific exotic armor is actually rather weak for PvP, save for this surge of Geomag stabilizers. Dawnblade is pretty weak when it comes to solar exotics, and Arc really only has Geomags as a strong contender. Most of Warlock's exotic strength comes in the form of neutral exotics, of which there are a couple to choose from. However, again, not much has really changed here either due to new exotics that were introduced not having a big impact on the PvP tier list. The top contenders for PvP in terms of neutral exotics continue to be Transversive Steps and Ophidian Aspects above all else. When speed is everything, these are going to shine, no matter what kind of speed you're looking for. Transversive allows for auto reloads while sprinting and gives you additional sprint speed, and Ophidian allows for insane weapon ready speeds and reloads. They affect a large portion of your gameplay for the entire match, not just abilities, not just supers, but your guns. Getting the most out of an exotic is important when it comes to your selection, and these will be active all the time in every game, no matter what. A close third is Karnstein Armlets, allowing you to stay in the fray with instant heals and constant health regeneration for a few seconds after a melee kill. Going into fights with full and regenerating health is a massive advantage, increasing the time it takes to kill you. You just need to be in a position to punch people very often, but keep in mind that you can proc this with Top Tree Dawn's ranged melee attack. Eye of Another World gets some points for just being an exotic that does a thing that you don't really need to keep track of, but other top exotics also have this same feature, making this a bit of a weaker selection. Astrocyte Verse is a movement exotic, but one I haven't seen much of thanks to Icarus Dash. You can only use Blink on Voidwalker. Voidwalker isn't the most popular at the moment, so therefore Astrocyte Verse is just not going to be very popular. Also, it's apparently still broken where the weapon ready speed is still not working. Apotheosis Veil has some very niche use in more intimate PvP settings where you can bait the enemy into chasing you down and then you activate your super into full health. In PvE, it's a get out of jail free card, but ideally you're not placing yourself in that kind of position in the first place. Then we have the rest of the exotics for Warlocks. These are either more niche exotics that can work with certain builds and playstyles, exotics that are just outmatched by others, or exotics that are just not really in the meta. The Stag can generate a lot of PvP Rift energy due to how often you're likely losing your shields, and I actually think quite highly of it, but otherwise this doesn't really get that much attention. Starfire Protocol's Fusion Grenade Rift combo has always been interesting, but it's never really broken into the mainstream in PvE because of Phoenix Protocol. While there is some niche build potential with it in both PvE and PvP, double healing grenades, double heat rises, it doesn't have the greatest ease of use, not to mention Sunbracers and Phoenix Protocol just kind of blow this out of the water. Wings of Sacred Dawn demand a very specific playstyle, a playstyle I imagine most players are not comfortable with or experienced enough to really utilize, not to mention its high-risk, medium-reward perk, locking you in the air. Vesper of Radius also has to compete against Phoenix Protocol. In higher-end activities, getting surrounded by enough enemies that this would be useful usually means you're gonna die before you're even able to pop the rift in the first place. Sanguine Alchemy got a complete rework compared to its previous perk, to where it now pauses the timer on your rift if you get a kill in said rift, extending its duration. This isn't a bad perk at all, but if you're going to stay locked into a position for a little while, you can probably just drop a Phoenix Well and get most of that super energy back to drop another Phoenix Well. Prometheum Spur has a fun-sounding perk, but in practice, it's not that much more than a novelty. Warlocks, that's going to do it for your tier list update. Not a very significant update, but you probably knew that going into this video. Warlocks definitely have some good exotics, but in my opinion, they're probably the worst of the three classes when it comes to overall exotic strength. So I do wonder if we see some more reworks or buffs coming to Warlock exotics over the next year. Hunters, you guys are up next, and if you thought this update didn't have a lot going on, wait until yours gets uploaded. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.